anybody who's a serious Marxist, like Marx, right, would not change for 150 years. It's just ridiculous.
He would if he knew he was right, Michael, and we all know he's right. Listen, let me just here's what I wanna do. I wanna take a quick break and then do another 30, 40 minutes. Do you have that much time, or do you need to go?
Sure. I'm
Okay.
happy to do whatever you want.
Yeah, okay, so we got the one for the public. Now, behind closed doors, Michael, I'm gonna go after you like a good sectarian Marxist should.
Okay.
Okay, all right,
That's fun.
and we'll have fun.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs, we don't see
still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Zero Squared is the Zero Books podcast. All right, so Michael Albert, welcome back. You are a longtime activist, writer, and organizer, known primarily for your affiliation with Z Communications and your original writing on and support for participatory economics and a participatory society. You've written a lot of books, articles, and even a novel, but one of your books is for us, for Zero Books, and it's entitled No Bosses. Thanks for coming back on. And thanks for writing the book.
Thank you for having me on again.
So I have these sort of standard questions that I thought we might get out of the way at first, but like the kind of questions that anyone might ask you. So the first question I have here is, how did you and Robin Hanel come to write together and come to formulate participatory economics?
Well, we wrote together, or we came together because I had a high school best friend who went to Harvard. I went to MIT, and that person who was my friend roomed with Robin in the freshman dorm. And so I met Robin. And, we got along very well, and we had similar politics, et cetera, et cetera. And then, so we're friends, right? And we're becoming more and more involved in the movements of the times. And I guess he was in the class of 68 and I was in the class of 69. So he was 1 year older. And we're working together in the student movement in Cambridge and greater Boston. And we are constantly well, not constantly, that's a slight exaggeration, but we're frequently encountering people who are saying, basically, I get what you're against. It's not complicated. I understand you don't like X, Y, and Z, what we're all familiar with. But what are you for? Because if you don't have anything that you can offer instead, you got no right to be sounding off so much, in essence. And so the request for vision was, in some sense, a request for us to shut up about the war and everything else, right? And so, of course, we thought that was totally ridiculous and unreasonable, and that I think I put it this way once. I said, you don't have to have an alternative for dealing with cotton and so on and so forth to be an abolitionist against slavery. You don't have to have every answer up front. And I think that's technically right. But I began to feel that it was strategically wrong. And that a lot of the people who were asking or who felt the question felt it legitimately. And they were basically saying, look, you want me to become involved in social movements that take time and effort and energy and even involve risk of losing friends, risks of problems with jobs, and risks with law. And I don't want to do that if it's not going anywhere. And that was a legitimate, reason. And the absence of compelling answers, I felt, was crippling. I actually think it's become more crippling since. It was less crippling then. But in any event, that's what spurred Robin and I to start addressing that.
So you were attempting to set out to plan an alternative to capitalist relations as the answer to people who were saying, if you don't like the system as it is, what are you going to do to replace it?
Basically, that was the initial impetus, I guess you could say.
And how long did it take you guys to work that out? Did you feel as though you were qualified from the get-go, or did you have to do a lot of study just to write the book, or had you already been educated?
I suppose that's sort of interesting. Well, we were sort of politically educated by practice and so on, but I was in physics at MIT, but Robin was in economics. And I actually remember, for what it's worth, one day in the midst of all this turmoil, this political activism turmoil, Robin and I were in the student union at MIT, and I took him into a small room there, and I said, okay, teach me Marxist economics. And he did. And I would say it took about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. I don't really remember exactly. It's been a long time. But he did. And neither one of us were too... I mean, we both thought, of course, there's a tremendous amount of validity and truth and insight, especially compared to the nonsense that prevails in, many classes and so on and so forth. But we weren't convinced that this was a perspective and a framework that was going to deal well with and efficiently and successfully and fully with the kinds of situations that we were encountering, including trying to answer the question, what do you want? So your answer to whether or not we started, in other words, whether we just reeled off the answers, so to speak. No, we read a lot of stuff, council communists, anarchists, very influenced by all of that, and also certain Marxist literature. And but as time went along, actually, the first thing that came out of us was just me. It was a book called "What Is to Be Undone." I was pretty good with titles, so I thought that was a clever title. And even in that, you can see the beginning of the vision, but it's not developed. And over time, it became more developed.
Yeah. So, do you think that people are more or less open to Paracon today than they were, let's say, in 1991 when your book, The Political Economy of Participatory Economics, was first published?
I don't know. When that book was published, Paracon, which is that the
big one? No, what was the first book?
The first book, I'd have to look and see what the name was. But
okay, which one's the definitive book?
The one I think that was the first. Anyway, when Paracon was published, there was a big audience for it, but a big audience that wasn't reached very effectively. The evidence that there was a big audience for it was sort of mind-boggling to me. There's a bookstore in Cambridge that's right across the street from Harvard Yard. It's called the Harvard Bookstore. And so I went in there after the thing had been published, and there was, the book sitting in a big stack on the table in front, actually more than one stack. That was flabbergasting, right? Ordinarily, what happens is, other things that I had written would go in 2 copies, and if they ran out, they'd probably not get replaced.
Yeah, that's the story of my freaking life, Michael.
Right.
That's all of my novels.
Right. Yeah. So in any event, there they were. Yeah. And I was shocked. And so I went up to the desk and I said, "What?" They didn't know who I was. I said, "What's with that book?" And they said, "Oh, it's really good. Try it out." And I said, "Well, how's it doing?" And then I was really floored because they said, "Well, it was our second bestseller in the last few weeks." And this is the Harvard Bookstore. This is a well-traveled bookstore. Lots of people.
Right.
So I said, well, what sold more? And there was a Gresham book that had come out around the same time, which sold more. But that was all.
Yeah.
I said, I can't really? And they persisted with that. And what it said to me was that, and it's not just that book, right? But that left books that really were addressing something that, people cared about, if put front and center, if given, the space and the momentum, would do really well. And that the problem wasn't the relevance or the potential audience of the books. The problem was visibility, in the form of, well, in that form was one possibility, but also in the form of prominent reviews, discussions, et cetera, et cetera. And it's been that way ever since. And what the relative audience is now, it might be larger. It depends how you calculate these things. So, I mean, take all the people who are willing to vote for Bernie Sanders, and had he run for president, all the people who would have been willing to vote for him. And he calls himself a socialist. So the idea of, and then there are these polls that say that, more than 50% of young people identify more with socialism than with capitalism. Okay, so it isn't clear what they're actually identifying with. It's probably social democracy, or it's probably just, I don't like what's going on. But in any event, no boss is a new economy for a better world. That's an audience. However, and this, of course, is your part of this. Well, it's partly my part of this book too. How do you put it in front of people, and how do you put it in front of people without it being seeming to be so discordant to reality, seeming to be from outer space? How do you put it in front of people in a way that people will look and say, that looks good?
What do you think about? I mean, obviously, I think it's if you have a book placed on a table at the very front of a bookstore in big stacks, that communicates to the people walking in that this is a big mainstream book that the bookstore thinks should sell. But like in the world of politics and the larger world, it seems like what you need to have is somebody who's proposing a policy. Like Andrew Yang put UBI on the table, in a way that it hadn't been for a long time. I'm not a fan or proponent of UBI, but it was a kind of kooky idea when he started his campaign, and now it's being discussed much more seriously. Can you think of a way someone might take up Paracon as a plank in a political campaign, as a part of their policy proposals?
I think it would be a little early to do that. We're not on the edge of changing the whole economy, right? But you could, around any number of issues. So take, for instance, raising the minimum wage. You can fight for a higher minimum wage for $15 or $20 or whatever it is, right? And so you're fighting for that particular thing. But the way you fight for it, you can talk about, well, what should be the norm of remuneration in a good economy, in a good society? What should be the way we do it? We're demanding this now, but what's the real reason behind it? And the same thing could be done vis-a-vis demands for ecological constraints on the market system, or a shorter workday, or whatever you want to talk about. The issue is what makes talking about those things more than a reformist is that the way you do it and the way you organize for it, instead of it being an end and it leading nowhere further, still a good thing if you win, but it leading nowhere further. Instead of that, you organize for it and you talk about it and you educate around it in a way that when you win, leaves you wanting more, because now you have changed values and you have changed attitudes about what is really desirable, et cetera, et cetera. So in that sense, yes, I think it can be connected to what's going on.
So I'm going to go meta here and let people see behind the curtain a little bit and ask you a question as your publicist.
Okay. You can ask me anything you want, Doug.
Yeah. Okay. I know. But I'm telling. When I tell you these things, I'm also talking to the audience.
To the audience.
Right?
Right.
I'm telling.
I understand.
It's all a performance. Don't look behind the curtain for real, Michael.
Right.
Okay. So here's the thing. Let's say I'm gonna write an email, and I should try this. I haven't actually ever done this. I don't know why, but let's say I'm gonna write an email to Good Morning America.
Okay.
And I'm gonna say you should have Michael Albert on because he has something to tell the American people that they really need to hear. What should I compare you to, or who should I mention that they would understand? Like I should say, Michael Albert. The first thing that came to mind from my last question is like, you think UBI is radical? Michael Albert has a plan for America that will give everyone a living wage and the power to live their lives the way they want to.
Okay, so that part's fine, right?
Yeah.
The comparison to somebody there, I'm not really sure. I mean, you could say.
You see the problem now. We need Noam Chomsky with manufacturing consent to walk in and explain why it is so hard to get ideas like yours onto.
Right. I mean, it's not. Well, that I can explain. I mean, that's not hard to understand. Mm-hmm. But you're asking a very specific question, which is a good way to approach things like this, which is in the course of saying to somebody, I don't think Good Morning America is likely going to happen, but in the course of saying to Russell Brand or to Joe Rogan or whatever, right? Look, I got this book coming out from this guy, and it's about no bosses. It's about a new economy for a better world. And countless people now are worried about this. They're worried about it because not just of the economy sort of being in crisis and creating the crisis of the climate, of global warming and ecological disaster, which threatens humanity and literally survival, but also because people have come to understand that they shouldn't have to spend their whole life alienated and lacking dignity and lacking a degree of control. That these things are beginning to resonate with people, that there could be more to life, that you don't have to be subject to bosses all the time. You don't have to, have no control over your life, etc. And this guy's got this book, which puts forth a view that considerable number of people around the world support that, and then you can continue on with a very brief account of what's in the book or something. But comparing it to a person, I guess you could say something like, in the same way. Oh, I don't want to do this. I mean, because if it's going to be a person who's known, it has to be somebody who's famous, and then it sounds like I'm comparing myself to that famous person.
Yeah, like in the same way that Jesus Christ brought you a new relationship with God.
Exactly. That was where I wasn't going to Jesus Christ, but I was going to. Well, Martin Luther King woke us up and
even more arrogant than Jesus Christ, Martin Luther King,
or Chomsky on foreign policy, or et cetera, et cetera. And look, the truth is, most of these things are not rocket science, right? So participatory economics, it's not like coming up with general relativity or something. It isn't. It's nothing like that. The only thing hard about it, and I'm not even sure that's an apt word, but if we're going to use it, the only thing hard about it is that it's way outside the box. It's not that it's it's hard calculation, it's hard thought, it's hard logic. It's not any of that. It's just that it's so different from what is commonplace and what is considered just the way it is, inevitable, that it's hard to get to it. But that's all. And then when we were lucky enough to come out of the 60s, and that sort of made us, in a way, immune to that. I mean, honestly, in other words, coming through that whole process, we weren't wired into any prior conceptions. And if anything, we were inclined to challenge everything. And so the fact that it was common sense that, you had to have a division of labor like we have, or you had to have markets, or people had to earn widely disparate amounts for incentive. Those views, they didn't hold us for 10 seconds. They just didn't, right? They were untried shibboleths of economics, which we didn't accept. And so it wasn't all that hard. It really wasn't. The hard task is the other one, the one that you confront. The hard task was and remains getting this vision or any other vision, if this one isn't as good as I hope it is, but getting a vision taken seriously, and getting people to share it and to utilize it in figuring out what to do in the present. That's the hard task.
Before we published your book, we published a different book by a man who just passed away, Fritjof Bergman. He wrote a book called New Work, New Culture.
I haven't read it. Sorry.
Yeah. I didn't think you would have. Not enough people have. We didn't do right by him, But it was his life work, and he had developed a plan to change the nature of work so that people would find primarily the big idea from the book, and it's a big, thick book, and he explains everything in a lot of detail. It's philosophical, but the main idea is if you give people work that they find personally meaningful, that they can, then they can create worlds for themselves. They can create lives for themselves that will be much more rewarding than if you focus on mass production and efficiency and things like that. And he also was interested in ecology, so it was emphasized what's personally meaningful for the individual and the community, find reusable materials and techniques and so on to do the work. And he was actually taking this to corporations and to NGOs, and had some success, and he'd gone to prisons and worked with prisoners on the ideas in his book and things like that. Do you think that that Paracon might also be able to be implemented in stages now, or that has it been taken up by activists in some way or another already?
Sure. There are people in lots of different places in the world who subscribe to, I don't know what word to use, who are advocates of this particular economic vision. Yes. There's an organization called Real Utopia, and it's at realutopia.org on the internet. And that's just started. And that was put together by a couple of folks in the UK, in England. And it's got about 40 people already who are networking together, all of whom are supporters of not just participatory economics, but participatory society, the whole broader culture, kinship, politics, and so on. And there's more than that. There are other people, of course. There are lots of people in various places. But it is true that it's hard in two ways. I think there are two big hurdles. If we assume for a minute, and it's an assumption, that this vision is really solid. This vision is really, when people talk about socialism, when people talk about controlling their own lives, when people talk about anarchism and participation and self-management, this is what actually delivers it. This is a set of institutions that are consistent with these aspirations of people on the left. Okay, let's assume that's the case for a minute. Even if that's the case, it's still a hard task. And I think the two hardest things about it are the one that you addressed already. In connecting it to daily activity now, right? In other words, so that you're being involved with it contributes to and aids what you're doing now. So you have a real incentive to pay attention. And, so that's one thing. The second thing is maybe idiosyncratic to my view of it. In the same way that what had been called socialism, and I guess some people still call it socialism, the 20th century brand, certainly challenged owners, challenged capital, and was therefore never supported by them, with a few like Engels was a capitalist, with a few exceptions. But capitalists, by and large, saw their interest as not furthered or advanced, but instead challenged and threatened by this thing. And so they opposed it vigorously. And so you wouldn't expect to see, I mean, we totally understand, you wouldn't expect to see institutions that are ruled by owners, right, taking up and promoting and making visible even that kind of socialist formulation. Okay, well, so the second thing that's a problem for the participatory economics, I think, is that it adds a new dimension to that. So it's not only anti-capitalist. That is, it not only says, look, we have to get rid of the basis for the 2% running the whole show. And that basis is private ownership of the means of production. And so we have to do away with that. Okay, so now participatory economics, like socialism over the past 100 years, for all the way back, has owners as an enemy and impeding the likelihood of it reaching an audience. Okay, but the problem is that participatory economics goes another step, and it says, look, there's a class between owners and workers, and that class, we call it the coordinator class. Once upon a time, and Barbara and John Ehrenreich called it the professional managerial class. Anarchists way back much earlier called it the intelligentsia. We didn't like either of those two formulations, so we called it coordinator class. Maybe not a good name, but that's what we called it. And what we had in mind was that people who, by virtue of their position in the economy, which is to say, by virtue of the implications of their economic activity for them, dominate other people. So it was a set of people who held empowering work, who did empowering work. They did tasks in their job that gave them information, that gave them connections to other people, social ties that are empowering, confidence, access to immediate decision making, and so on. And then there was another set of tasks that were virtually the opposite. They de-skilled people instead of giving them skills, that especially skills associated with decision making. They de-skilled people. They fragmented people. They reduced people's confidence. They reduced people's connections, and so on. And so for us, that's another class between labor and capital. And in fact, one of the things that seriously propelled, I suppose you could say, participatory economics was we had spent a lot of time looking at the old formulations, looking at Marxism-Leninism, looking at anarchism, and also looking at the societies. And so we had written things like Unorthodox Marxism, or Marxism and Socialist Theory, and Socialism Today and Tomorrow. These were books looking at all that stuff. And what we came to was that, look, this thing, it did get rid of owners, but it's not classless. It has a ruling class, and the ruling class is this coordinator class. So what happens with participatory economics is it not only irritates the hell out of owners, but a subset of this other group, coordinator class, it irritates, and it's like a natural gut reaction. It's called class interests and class consciousness. They see and understand that there's something going on here that threatens a part of their advantage, a part of their dominance. Now, a subset of that set of people actually will support it. Myself, right? Actually will support it, like Engels supported, old style socialism. But another subset won't. And that other subset, I think, not maliciously, not trying to defend hierarchy per se, but sort of automatically is dislikes, all right, thinks it will be destructive, right, to eliminate that particular hierarchy. So you can imagine it in a left institution, right? Forget it. Take a left media institution.
Yeah, let's say 0 books.
Well, in the case of 0 books, you have to shoot yourself. No. So
No, right.
in
No, I was just thinking, I was a worker
larger
for
the
20
larger,
years. Yeah, and now I have a little bit of power
right.
and authority, and I wouldn't want to share it with everyone else. I want to be able to decide things.
Right.
It's the first time in my life, really,
Right.
as a professional, I can do that.
Understood.
So,
and
yeah.
and all right, another recent example was Nathan Robinson, and
yeah, I knew you were going to bring him
what's
up.
it called again?
Current affairs.
Current
I just wanted
affairs.
to put myself in front of him, take a bullet before
Okay.
he got shot.
Very sweet of you.
Yeah.
No, but I'm not going to shoot him either, or you.
Right. Mhm.
In other words, it's not. The issue that's being brought up is, can we have institutions on the left and eventually in a whole society in which we don't have 20% ruling 80%? Okay, so that's going to mean that the 20%, or the people who thought they were going to be the 20%, that the 20% have less dominance, let's call it. And in the case of participatory economics, they're going to have to do a job that's more mixed than they were doing before, that has a fair share, let's call it, of disempowering tasks in it, so that other people can do jobs that have a fair share of empowering tasks, so that we're all prepared by our work and our prior training for work to participate, and to participate confidently and intelligently in decision making. Okay, so the idea that somebody would be horrified by that is the fault of say the advocates of participatory economics in some sense. That is, if the image is that a left organization in which some people who founded it probably and who have been involved in it for a long time and have worked their butts off forever and have accumulated lots of skills and connections and all the kinds of things that are empowering, right? But that also get things done, right? Are going to have to lose some of that, and people without training are going to have to gain some of that. There'll be this feeling that, wait a minute, you're asking us to risk our organization. You're saying to us that these folks are going to do what we're doing, and I don't believe it. I'm afraid it's going to. And I just want to make one analogy. If you go back to the 60s and you notice that, for example, women said to the movement, I'll give you a very graphic example of it. I was actually chairing an anti-war movement meeting, a few hundred people, and we're talking about upcoming demonstrations and policies. And suddenly, and this is a true story, suddenly the door opens, and in walks about, 35, 40 women. And they circle the front of the room. One of them says to me, "Michael, you better sit down." And I'm not an idiot. I sat down. and they announced to the room, "Look, here's the way it's going to be from now on. From now on, the anti-war movement is not going to be sexist the way it has been sexist. When there are chairs, they're going to be at least half women. When there is a decision-making body, it's going to be at least half women. When people go out to speak, it's going to be at least half women. Not only that, what we speak about is going to include issues of gender, even while it's attacking the Vietnam War." And the reaction of men at the time was by and large, and of some women also, right? Not only men, was by and large, wait a second, we're bombing the shit out of the Vietnamese.
That's what just flashed through my mind. How
Right.
much more successful was the peace movement for that move?
Right. We're bombing the shit out of the Vietnamese, and they're saying, right, you're asking us to sacrifice some of what we can generate on behalf of and in support of the Vietnamese for this nonsense, some of them would say, or others would say, for this, justifiable concern, but let's not, risk too much for this concern. All right. Now, the reality was
Go ahead.
that the women were right, that the creation of a movement that would be stronger and would be better able to function and would sustain itself longer depended upon these kinds of changes. And so now if we take the analogy to the other case, right?
Mm-hmm.
In the short run, let's say, you and I are running a publishing house, and we've got 10 other workers there, and we're doing most of the empowering stuff, 20%, 8 other workers. And the 8 other workers are doing a lot of, moving stuff around and typesetting and whatever they're doing, right? But it's not very empowering. And they come along and say, look, it's time for this to change, like the women did. And they say, we're for classlessness, you're for classlessness. This is not classless, right? And we think that it also is not as efficient and as effective as it could be. It is not utilizing the talents that we have. It is, in fact, and it has tensions between us that needn't be there, and so on and so forth. Now, okay, that's an argument. One could say it's wrong. I think it's right. When South End Press came along, this was a publishing house that we did, a long time ago. It was incredibly efficient. It had very few people. It had very few resources. It had almost, no money. It ran in a way, this was actually before participatory economics had been codified, so to speak, had been spelled out fully. What happened is we sat around. We were all movement people. And we sat around in a room and we said, what are we going to do? And how are we going to organize ourselves? And people said democratically, people should have a say, and so on. And then somebody pointed out rightly, for example, look, Michael's good friends with Chomsky. He can, maybe he wouldn't want to, but he could use that to get his way on issue after issue. And so is the one who knows the potential donor and could use that. So in other words, it wasn't that there was a gigantic disparity of prior training. There was some, right? But people could have access to the empowering facets of this small publishing house and rise in it as a result, and then other people. And we decided against all that. And this was the origin of what became balanced job complexes. We figured out what the tasks were, and we divided them among us into jobs that were doable. A person could do them. It wasn't, you have to do one task over here and one task over here that are, a set of tasks that people could do such that everybody would be able to function. And everybody did do editorial. Everybody did choose books. Everybody did, the critical publishing things. And then also everybody did typesetting, which in those days was the most onerous, difficult. Everybody did that. I mean, I did as much or more typesetting than anybody else did. So, and that was the origin of, that was the practical origin of the idea of balanced job complexes.
Let me ask you a question about the women who came in to the peace
sure
and made that demand. Was there a process? Did this organization have a membership that voted in people?
Well, yes and no, right? The actual group that was there was just a mass meeting of people around an upcoming demonstration. So no, it wasn't a membership organization. But on the other hand, people knew each other. I mean, these are different times, right? We were all in the same tribe. I don't know what you want to call it, right?
Right.
And
so there wasn't really an organization
there.
It was just a group meeting in a community.
Well, but this same thing happened in organizations. I mean, it happened in SDS chapters. It happened in...
Yeah, but if you're an SDS and a group of
people...
I don't care.
It happened in the old mole. which was a publication. Right. So in other words, I was a student at the time, but it happened in the old Mole, which was a local newspaper, a very radical newspaper in Cambridge.
Yeah. So if you're okay, let's say you're in the old Mole, or let's say you're in SDS, and which is if I'm remembering correctly, I wasn't part of it, but that's before my time. But that's a membership organization. It's democratic. There are votes on a slate of representatives and so on. And a group of people come in and say, on the basis of our gender, we are going to demand that half of the current leadership that's been duly elected by the membership steps down. I'm not so sure that that's a progressive thing at all. I would say what should be done
depends how you do it.
What should be done is someone should make a proposal, then put it to the membership of a way to train and diversify.
But this thing wasn't that, right? In other words, this thing wasn't a membership. It wasn't a voting. It wasn't like that. It was basically these women saying to the movement in Cambridge, right? The anti-war movement, which wasn't an organization, it was a movement, right? They were basically saying, look, the movement has to change. And this is what we're saying. And we're in the same way that you're willing to disrupt activities on behalf of, fighting the war, we're willing to disrupt activities on behalf of two things. One, overcoming sexism, and two, we think also fighting the war, because we think the war will be fought much more successfully. In other words, the against the war will be carried out much more successfully if we do it in this manner. Okay, so if we come back to the present.
Come back to the present.
Because the present situation is more complicated, right? So if you say, the word that would be used on the left is transition, right? So in other words, let's say you have a pretty big organization. So let's say you have a 100-person organization and there's 20 people who really are monopolizing decision-making power. You might even have democratic votes, but everybody can predict how the vote's going to go because that group of 20 wields so much influence and so much power because it has the information, it comes to the meeting with, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's say it's a group among the 80 who basically say we need to figure out what we have to do about our organization, and the 20% says why, and the 80% says, well, for starters, count the number of working class people in this organization, and why is it so low? We understood once upon a time that the number of women in the organization was so low because the organization was sexist and it wasn't attractive. It was, in fact, debilitating. And the number of blacks in the organization was low. Why? Because it was, and what we're saying to you is the same thing is true now. Working people understand what we're talking about. They understand the difference between themselves and doctors and lawyers and engineers and managers and decision makers to whom they are, subject. Their lives are sort of designed and limited and organized by those people, and they understand that. I'll tell you another little story, and it is relevant. I have to try and do this without. Anyway, Lydia Sargent's son, one of her sons, I won't go into detail about the people, but he had an almost gut reaction to the no nukes movement. He's critical of it, and couldn't sort of relate to it. And it wasn't
no nuclear bombs or no nuclear plants?
No nuclear plants.
Okay.
That's what was called no nukes. That was anyway. And so did a lot of other people and lots of working people. And I spent some time trying to think about, okay, so how does that work, right? It's one thing for women to see there's no women, or for blacks to see there's no blacks, or for blacks to see the blacks are all in the back moving around the boxes, right? And none of them are playing any other role. So it's easy to see that. It seems like it's harder to see the working class thing. But for instance, in that movement, there was a tremendous focus on the danger and the threat that nuclear reactors posed in the form of a meltdown or the waste. And so the argument went, well, because of that, they have to be shut down. And so it was a big movement, a very large
I remember.
movement at the time.
Yeah.
And it's not that it was wrong, although that even could be argued, but I don't think it's that it was wrong. But what was evident was the movement never sort of calculated, okay, what about coal mines, right? What's the health effect of coal mines as compared to nuclear reactors?
Well,
What's the health of...
pretty horrible.
Yeah, absolutely horrible.
Probably worse than a nuclear
Worse,
power
exactly
plant.
right. But that isn't noticed, right? And so the question becomes...
Because it doesn't affect upper middle class people in their homes.
And so, but working people understand that. And that's what that person's, Lydia Sun's antipathy to, that's what fueled it, right? That's class consciousness that isn't out of a book. You just feel it, right? And it goes on both sides. So it's what I was trying to describe, that a coordinator class person can just feel there's something about this participatory economics thing that rubs me wrong. So I'll ridicule it, right? Or I'll dismiss it without even looking, really.
Yeah.
So that's one kind of class consciousness. And then the other kind of class consciousness is there's something about this goddamn movement, the way these people carry themselves, the way they, et cetera, right? I taught in prison once, and one of the prisoners there taught me a lesson that I never forgot. He said to me, you know, when you walk down the street and there's a person walking toward you that is almost a natural, understood rule of who gets out of the way. And he said, it isn't just, the black gets out of the way of the white. This is a long time ago. Or the woman gets out of the way for the man. It's also, and you can see it in dress, and you can see, so the signs are there. It's that this coordinator class group, we were talking about it in this prison class, is deferred to by working class people who get out of the way. So this kind of class consciousness is real. And the striking thing is...
Go ahead. I was going to say, I always get out of the way. I just always am the one getting out of the way.
The striking thing is that working people have nowadays, I think, a more gut class consciousness of this sort about doctors, lawyers, engineers, et cetera, than about owners. Why? Because they never encounter owners, right? They don't, they just never, no owner ever fucks them over personally, right? Institutionally, yes. Structurally, yes. But they never encounter them. They never have that gut visceral experience. And they do with the other group.
Can I tell you a little story?
And that's what Trump plays to.
I know. Can I tell you a little story off to the side of that?
Yeah.
The one time in my life where I really felt like the struggle for socialism and the working class had some teeth to it, what really mattered, was when I was about 26 years old. I think I was 25 years old. I was working at a physician's answering service, taking emergency calls. We're all untrained. None of us are, you have a heart attack, you call us up. We ask you, is it an emergency? Because we can't make that decision. No kidding. But anyway, I'm there and I'm sitting on my lunch break and I'm reading some tract like abolish the capitalist class is on the front of it, right? And the guy who ran the company, the physician's answering service, he was almost never there, but he was there. And he saw me on my lunch break, and he saw what I was reading, and he could not help himself but to come up to me and say, "That's total garbage. Right. You have to know that's complete. This place would fall apart. This place, you guys want to take over? You want to do what I do? this place would fall apart.
Right.
And I was just like, oh, really? You're scared? I had no idea that you would be scared. I thought I was pretending. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So anyway,
It's no, the other that's true actually, that they understand better than we do typically the dangers for themselves. That's both those classes. So I said earlier something about how it was the fault of the advocates of the vision in some sense, right? And the reason for that is because if we put across that we're basically saying, string up the coordinators, string up the lawyers, the doctors, the engineers, et cetera, et cetera. Well, of course they're not going to like us, and of course they're going to, the argument that they'll give would be the argument that your guy gave. Yeah, the whole thing will fall apart. That's what Margaret Thatcher was saying. When Thatcher said there's no alternative, she's not saying there is nothing else. She's saying there's no better alternative. If you make any changes, things will get worse. Any significant changes of that sort. So, the task, and it's not easy. The task is to address the need for classlessness in a way that doesn't alienate and that, in fact, speaks to real needs of the coordinator class, the ruling class, the capitalist class. I don't care about, put them in New York, cut the bridges, and let them live however they want.
That sounds racist to me, Michael. I don't know. I don't like that New York reference. Okay, it's a Jewish thing there. Put them in New York, but anyhow, I know you didn't mean it that way.
No,
no, of course.
Everybody else leaves. It's just they get Manhattan.
I know, but why New York, Michael? What are you saying?
Because why?
Around the world?
Because Manhattan has bridges all around it.
I got you. I know.
Right. That's literally what I'm. The joke. All right. Obviously, we're not going to do that. But the point is that other group has to be part of the change. That other group needs to be, to the extent possible, on the side of the effort to change the economy. And so,
the coordinator class needs to be there. Yeah.
And will they all be? No, of course they won't. But a whole lot of them have to be. And actually, we know it's possible because in May of '68 in France, you saw exactly that. You saw that group somehow energized and sort of awakened by all that was going on. And a great, great many of them were coming over. That's what has happened.
I have a question. Do you think that you and I are part of the coordinator class?
Well, the way we are now, right? Arguably not so much, right?
Right.
But yes, that is the kind of job that you have, the kind of jobs that I've had are typically coordinator class jobs. Our prior training, I don't know yours, but mine is certainly
BA in philosophy. So I don't know if that's training for anything.
That's training to okay, but my training was a lot in science and so on, and then economics, and sure, coordinator class. So and it's partly a mentality, it's partly a kind of confidence, it's partly a knowledge. It can be you certainly have skills and knowledge and a self-image and so on and so forth. I don't know your income. You might not have parlayed it into, as doctors and lawyers and engineers do, a significantly higher than average income, but that's all right. It's still coordinator class. It's just incompetent coordinator class.
Yeah, thank you. And you know firsthand, having worked.
Absolutely. But I'm also, I've put in more years than you have, and probably have less to show.
Okay.
Materially.
Let me ask you one question here at the end, because we're coming up on an hour.
Okay.
There's an alternative explanation of class than what you've been talking about. I mean, I think everything that you've been talking about so far rings true, especially your example about the kid who really hated nuclear power. He hated the anti-nuclear power plant movement because of the way what it said about their views of the working class.
Yeah,
that was powerful, and I definitely think that's all true. But there's another way to think about the working class, which is just about what their relationship is to the means of production, whether or not they produce commodities. So this classic political economic Marxist approach. And, by that standard, sometimes people who make a lot of money and have some social power are working class. And sometimes
if you use that definition, yes.
Right. And sometimes people who don't make very much money and don't feel that they have much power are part of the coordinating class, like maybe you and me. And I feel like, as a Marxist, that while the politics has to take account of this other understanding of class, the one you're talking about, the actual changes in struggle have to understand the Marxist version of class.
Let me ask you a couple of questions, okay? So somebody comes along, forget the textbooks and forget the Bibles, right? The economy, the person says the economy yields differentiations among the actors in it that matter. Okay, so far we agree. The economy causes those differentiations to demarcate people into groups that have contrary interests and that clash over those interests. So far we agree. Now the person says, okay, one of the things that does that, and I think it's the only thing the person says, or the key thing, is the relationships and means of production. The extent to which you own the means of production, or you own only your ability to do work and you sell it. And my answer to that is, I agree. That is a feature, let's call it, of an economy that does demarcate into classes. I agree. But the reason it does that is because it intrinsically gives, as we said, one group a set of interests, another group a different set of interests. They clash. They see each other differently, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, and so I come along and say, this is what we did back when Barbara and John Ehrenreich wrote their piece, and then we did a book called Between Labor and Capital at South End Press, and Robert and I wrote a piece, and that was the first time we talked about this. And what we're basically saying is, yes, that's true. But there's another thing about the way an economy is organized and its intrinsic implications for the people functioning in it that can demarcate people into opposed groups. Now, are they important groups? Maybe not, right? So, but the thing that we were talking about wasn't that some people work in the city and some people work in the country, or that some people, et cetera, et cetera. But that people are empowered by what they're doing and some people aren't, are disempowered. And our claim was that seems to us to be not like, working with your hands or not working with your, not 100 different things that we could name, but something that's up there with that ownership one, in the sense of demarcating a big difference, 20% and 80%. But is it important? And so the answer for why the private property one is important is because, well, hell, the owners can become the ruling class. We have that new phrase. So, where they are, they're not alone influential, but they basically dominate the economic life of the country. And that makes that class division important. I agree. But hello, the division into the empowered and the disempowered, it turns out that once you get rid of the owning class, has the exact same result. The empowered becomes the new ruling class, dominating economic life. And the disempowered becomes, well, still the working class, dominated. So this was, basically our relationship to Marxism all the way back when had two key parts. One part has become sort of, the accepted norm nowadays by most people. And that part, and in those days it wasn't. That part was, well, wait a second. Economics is important, but so's race, so's gender, so's power. And, intersectionality, we had different names for it, but it's the same. Okay, so that was one concern we had with Marxism, that, yes, the economy casts a field of influence which affects all sides of life. But you know what? So does kinship. And so, and it impacts the economy like the economy impacts family, and so on and so forth. But the second one, which was, we thought, in a sense, more fundamental, because we thought that the first one, and we talked about it this way, that the first problem could be accommodated, that enlightened Marxists, let's call them, or Marxists with their eyes open, could say, okay, not a big deal for us. We've got this focus on the economy, but all that other stuff isn't just secondary or peripheral or whatever. It's important too. And so we had Marxist feminism, and we had socialist feminism, and we had nationalist Marxism, and we had anarcho-communism. And that's what that was. That was taking into account more than one sphere of life as important. So that was one of our concerns about Marxism. But the other one was this class issue. And that, we feared, was going to prove much more difficult, that Marxists were going to resist that innovation, so to speak. And that has proved true. And it's too bad, because it has created a situation in which, just like once upon a time, the sexism on the left limited the number of females. The racism on the left limited the number of, say, in the United States, blacks. Well, the classism on the left limits the number of working people relating.
It's ironic that Marxists should be the ones resisting your class analysis.
Isn't it? It's pretty incredible. You mentioned, a frustration of your life. Well, that's a frustration of my life.
Right.
I don't think I'm, people would say, he's anti-Marxist. He's, what does it mean, right? Anybody who's a serious Marxist, like Marx, right, would not change for 150 years. It's just ridiculous.
He would if he knew he was right, Michael, and we all know he's right. Listen, let me just, here's what I want to do. I want to take a quick break and then do another 30, 40 minutes. Do you have that much time?
Sure. I'm happy to do whatever you want.
Yeah. Okay. So we got the one for the public. Now, behind closed doors, Michael, I'm going to go after you like a good sectarian Marxist should.
Okay.
All right.
That's fun.
And we'll have fun. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.